It was really hard for me not to backstage fanboy all over her and talk about, if you haven't seen what she did at the end of the national championship game, she didn't introduce our stars. She introduced all the backups. And it was amazing. And I had to tell her that it brought tears to my eyes to see that recognition. And it reminded me of when I retired from football in 1994. I went to Northeastern University to the Center for the Study of Sport and Society. And one of my roles early on was to moderate a discussion that included Donald Lopiano, then Executive Director of the Women's Sports Foundation. And I heard Donald Lopiano say something that struck me, and I was just retiring from 7 years of professional football, coming out of playing college football at Syracuse University, and she said her fear about women's sports was that it would be seduced by the male model. And the male model, as we see today, has driven college sports into the ground, and has driven to what is now the extinction of the NCAA. And so to hear Dawn and to see her and to see all that she's accomplished at South Carolina, and to see her do it authentically her and authentically female is proof that women have not been seduced by that male model, which is really, really important if we're going to start talking about what's men's role in everything that this whole day is about. And I would be remiss if I didn't say what a privilege and an honor it is to be here. I'm reminded of a Bell Hooks quote that is actually the only person I quote in my book. And at the time that I started writing my book, I wasn't even that down on Bell Hooks, didn't understand Bell Hooks. And the quote is that, I know, right? Just pay attention, brother, pay attention. is that the first act of violence that patriarchy expects of males is not violence against women. It's an act of psychic self-mutilation that patriarchy asks of men, of boys, excuse me. And if boys don't do it to themselves, we will enact rituals that do it for them. And sports is one of those rituals. Why everything that you heard Dawn talking about, why it's so difficult to gain that respect, so difficult to get that platform, is because men still think that sports is the dominion of men. And it's why after 27 years of doing this work around gender equity and gender in sports and all the issues around men's violence against women, the thing I get quoted most in saying is that we don't raise boys to be men, we raise boys not to be women or gay men, because we're not telling boys what to be in their whole selves, we're just telling them what not to be. Don't be a sissy, don't be all the sexist and homophobic derogatory words that we use. That is the ritual. That is a deliberate and intentional way in which boys are raised to maintain patriarchy, to maintain that power and control. And so when we start talking about what's the role of men, what feels a little, not odd, but funny being here is that I'm usually talking to men about our job, what we need to do. So if you bear with me, what you're going to hear is a little bit of what I talk to men about. Because that you throw like a girl, the statement that is the title of my book, is saying to boys that women and girls are less than, and that leads to all issues of men's violence against women and all issues that you all are talking about so far here this morning. But there's this other part of it. What do boys and men learn? And what we learn and what we're raised on is being emotionally incapable or incompetent, and not just learning that we're incapable of it. And here's something that is more recent for me, is that we're unworthy of it. Because when you learn it at an early age, you're not worthy of your emotions. You're not worthy of your feelings. You're not worthy of your emotional authenticity. And what's really damaging about that for so many boys, and ultimately for women and girls in our lives, is that there's privilege attached to that. To being emotionally incapable and unworthy, as long as we remain silent, the patriarchy will protect us. And so there's a privilege in that silence. And I say all the time that my ultimate privilege as a man is my silence. I don't have to be engaged in the problem. I don't have to be engaged in work. That's why I say, there's a chapter in my book titled 29. I was 29 years old before I heard anyone talk about masculinity or issues of men's violence against women. And that privilege in our silence as men has led to terms like toxic masculinity. Because the only thing that we, and I say we collectively as a feminist and people who have been doing work around the prevention of men's violence against women, the only thing that we want men to address is the toxicity of masculinity that negatively impacts women's lives. And that is that I'm emotionally incapable, which means I'm not going to even try, And I'm unworthy, which means I don't see the value in it for me. And so that becomes, and I want to address this word, two things. One, privilege, and the other, toxicity, or toxic masculinity. I look at privilege this way. I don't look at privilege as I have something that I have to give up to make space for you so that you can, that's the privilege that we want to fight about. That's why white people get angry if you talk about white privilege. People of means will get angry if you talk about economic privilege. White folks will get upset if you talk about, because I didn't work for it and do anything for it. When I look at privilege is, what does it keep us from learning? What is it kept, my privilege as a man kept me to being 29 years old before I ever considered what it meant to be a man. Or 29 years old before I considered the violence in the lives of my sister, my mother, my daughter, of the women in my life at the time. And so what does that privilege keep you from? And what that privilege has kept us from as men is the conversation of how do we get better? And we've landed on terms like toxic masculinity. Our privilege is toxic. But just want to address this word toxic for a second. Before we talked about toxic in terms of masculinity or relationships, we talked about toxic in terms of waste. You remove waste. Waste is not even good with garbage. We can't do that. If we're going to ask men to be engaged in this, we have to replace it with something. We have to give them something. We can't just extract them. We can't just extract. And I spent some time talking to young men on college campus recently, and none of them talked about the word masculinity in any positive terms. And so I talk about aspirational masculinity. What do I want for you? All of the work we've been doing around men's violence against women has been, what do we want men to do for women? To protect? But what do we want for men? What do we want for our boys? That they live in their whole, so talk about authenticity, in the whole loving, caring, vulnerable, passive, submissive. That's not my feminine side. That is my wholeness as a man. So what aspirational masculinity is it changes the conversation from not at what we're asking men to do for women. What are we asking men to do for ourselves? And how are we as adult men going to help lead the next generation? If I don't see myself as worthy of the qualities that I typically would consider to be women's qualities, being loving, caring, vulnerable, emotional. If I don't see myself as worthy of those qualities, how can I trust or be led by women who exemplify that? And so as we start thinking about in the workplace, in different environments where we need this kinds of social change, it's not just working with our young boys coming up, but it's also how do we talk to men in the workplace? How do we talk to men in other environments that make them understand that we know the statistics. We know all the the statistics about women-led businesses. They do better. We know that because what you all bring to the table is expanding the conversation, not shrinking it. And so we have to show what's in it for men in that conversation. And I was talking to a group of people when I published my book, and I said, being a whole man, being that authentic, whole, aspirational masculinity is about being vulnerable and caring. And someone said, well, is it being passive and submissive? That's being a real man. I said, aren't you submissive to your God? And then as I got a little bit older and I taught my 16-year-old daughter how to drive. Talk about being vulnerable. Right? Submissive. And all those qualities that make you a better person. And so we have to welcome men into that conversation. And I know that's not a conversation that we're used to having, of how do we make spaces for men to have these conversations, but it is critically important if we're going to move this discussion that we get away from terms like toxic masculinity and start moving more towards aspirational masculinity so that we're doing this in a positive and proactive way. And as I said a moment ago, the research is telling us that. I've been doing this work for about 27 years now, having this conversation, and the more that I talk to young men, the more I realize this generation of young men have only heard their gender of masculinity being referenced with toxic as a prefix. So we have to show them that they are worthy. We have to show them that they are capable. And as I said, sometimes it's odd to be in a room like this where all of you all are doing such amazing work that is so far in advance of that sort of that fundamental conversation. But I always say that if you take a 5-year-old boy and a 50-year-old man and you talk about masculinity, the definition is going to be pretty similar. We're still struggling with being worthy and capable. And so as I stand here and say that it is a privilege and an honor to be here, I am joined by Tang Nguyen and Gary Barker, Tang of Open Comp and Gary Barker of Promundo USA. and the three of us comprise what we've been termed as the mantle. Yes, and we have all been struggling with what that title means exactly. So I am going to turn it over to the statistics that are going to introduce Gary and Tong about continuing the conversation with the next mantle. Thank you.